The stage was bathed in brilliant white light, the Tesla logo glowing behind a single podium. Thousands of the world's wealthiest individuals sat in the audience, their eyes locked onto the man who had changed industries with the wave of his hand. Tonight, they expected another revolution. Elon Musk stood before them, dressed in his usual black t-shirt and blazer. The anticipation in the room was electric. Investors, billionaires, and celebrities whispered among themselves. Their children, the future elite, clutched their phones, ready to tweet about whatever groundbreaking product was about to be revealed. Musk adjusted the microphone, his expression calm, composed. "This," he began, "is the future." A massive screen lit up behind him, showcasing an abstract, futuristic design. The murmurs of excitement rippled through the crowd. He was about to announce something big. And then, he stopped. For a full 5 seconds, he just stood there, looking out at the audience. The murmur died down. People frowned, exchanged puzzled glances. Something was off. Then Musk spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Have you ever thought about God?" The silence in the room was absolute. A few people chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke. But Musk didn't smile. His gaze was steady, his expression serious. "What if," he continued, "everything we perceive as reality is just a simulation? What if the universe was programmed?" The crowd was stunned. The future leaders of the world, the rational, the logical, the tech-driven minds, none of them had expected this. And yet, something about the way he said it made it impossible to dismiss. The words "have you ever thought about God" still hung in the air like a thunderclap before a storm. The audience, thousands of the wealthiest, most rational, most power-driven minds on the planet, stared at Elon Musk as if he had just spoken in an alien language. No one moved. No one breathed. A few nervous chuckles flitted through the massive auditorium, breaking against the oppressive silence like fragile glass. A venture capitalist near the front row raised an eyebrow, exchanging glances with a tech CEO beside him. Was this a joke? A setup for something bigger? And then the silence stretched. Too long. Too unnatural. This wasn't part of the show. Musk just stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room became physical. It pressed on their chests, making it hard to inhale. A man in the second row, an investor worth more than the GDP of small countries, leaned forward, his brows furrowing. "This is some kind of metaphor, right?" he asked, his voice laced with forced amusement. Musk didn't answer. A billionaire in the tech sector, known for his cold, calculating logic, shifted in his seat. His fingers twitched against the armrest. He was used to knowing trends, knowing power, knowing truth. But now? A supermodel in the VIP section frowned, whispering to her business mogul husband. "What is he doing?" Her husband shook his head slowly. A teenager in the audience, 16, the son of a real estate empire, felt his palms dampen. He had grown up worshipping Musk. This was the man of the future, the one who promised them Mars, AI, immortality. So why was he talking about this? This wasn't logic. This was madness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something worse. Something true. Musk finally moved. He didn't laugh. He didn't break the tension. He simply stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, studying the shifting expressions, the darting glances. "You think I'm joking," he finally said. Someone coughed, loudly. An intentional interruption. Musk ignored it. "What if I told you," he continued, "that the very fabric of our universe is coded? That physics, our so-called laws, follow patterns too precise, too structured, to be random?" The audience was locked onto him now, despite themselves. Despite the discomfort. Despite the fear creeping in the edges of their minds. A respected scientist in the front row scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, Elon. Don't do this." Musk tilted his head slightly. Do what? The scientist swallowed. You know exactly what. This kind of talk, it's dangerous. Musk's eyes flickered. For who? The words landed like a blow. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the scientist had no answer. 2.6, the murmurs begin. The murmurs started low, barely whispers, but they grew. This is a marketing stunt, someone muttered. He's leading up to an AI launch, another speculated. Maybe it's about Neuralink, said a third. Anything. Any explanation. Anything except what he was actually saying. A man in a sharp navy blue suit, one of Musk's biggest investors, suddenly stood up. His chair scraped against the polished floor. Elon, he said, his voice carefully controlled, this isn't what we came here for. Musk smiled. Isn't it? The investor exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. We fund you for technology. For science. Not for, he gestured vaguely. This. Musk didn't blink. What is technology, he asked, if not the pursuit of truth? A woman in the audience gripped the edges of her armrest. She wanted to leave. She wanted to dismiss this. She wanted to go home and forget any of this ever happened. But she couldn't. Because deep down, in a place she didn't want to admit existed, she had wondered. Late at night. Alone. Looking up at the sky. What if? What if there was more? 2.9, the fear they never knew they had. I'm not asking you to believe, Musk continued. I'm asking you to consider. The words hit like a pulse through the room. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. The most rational minds on the planet had spent their lives dismissing God as a fairy tale, as the weakness of those who needed comfort. And yet, now, confronted with the idea that reality itself might be programmed, they were more terrified than they had ever been in their entire lives. Because if Musk was right, it meant someone, or something, was in control. And it wasn't them. A deep voice from the back of the room finally broke through the chaos. Then tell us, Elon. All eyes turned. A man, one of the wealthiest in the world, stood, his expression like stone. If we're in a simulation, he asked, his voice sharp as a knife, who's running it? Musk's lips parted slightly. For the first time that evening, for just a moment, he hesitated. And the audience saw it. And the silence that followed was the loudest yet. The screen behind him changed. Rows of equations. Quantum mechanics. Simulation theory models. The deeper we look into reality, Musk said, the more we find patterns that shouldn't be there. Numbers embedded in physics, as if designed. Some faces in the audience paled. Others shook their heads. A renowned atheist physicist was leaning forward now, staring at the screen with wide eyes. Because he recognized the numbers. At first, the whispers were faint. Just scattered murmurs. A few voices in the sea of the world's most powerful minds, trying, desperately, to make sense of what they had just heard. A woman in the third row leaned toward her husband. He's teasing some new AI project, right? Her voice was brittle, uncertain. A CEO adjusted his tie, shifting in his chair. This has to be a prelude to something. He wouldn't just say that. An investor near the front crossed his arms. He's baiting us. There's no way he's serious. But as the whispers grew, so did the feeling in the air, something uneasy. Something not quite right. The first ripple of fear. A billionaire hedge fund manager, one of Musk's largest investors, glanced down at his assistant, who was already typing frantically on a tablet. Find out what the hell this is about, he muttered under his breath. Sir? I don't care what it takes. Get me something. Right now. The assistant hesitated. But what if he's serious? The billionaire shot her a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Musk isn't a philosopher. He's a businessman. And businesses don't talk about God. But even as he said it, even as he tried to convince himself, his hands were clenched into fists. The murmurs became waves now, crashing against each other. This is a publicity stunt. It has to be marketing. Maybe he's announcing some kind of AI consciousness project. Excuses. Rationalizations. People desperately trying to force reality back into a shape they understood. But the more they spoke, the more forced it all sounded. Because deep down, in the places they never spoke about, they had thought about it before. And yet, in the middle of all this, a man in the second row remained completely still. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't speculating. He was staring. His name was Alexander Roth. A trillionaire. Owner of the largest AI research company in the world. A man who prided himself on knowing things before anyone else did. And right now, he was watching Elon Musk with pure, calculating silence. Because he recognized something in Musk's voice. Something real. And that scared him more than anything. The whispers grew louder until one voice broke through it all. This is ridiculous. A man near the front row stood. Michael Larsen. Billionaire venture capitalist. A man who had built an empire on cold, ruthless logic. And right now, he was angry. Listen to yourself, Elon, he said, his voice sharp. You sound like some delusional monk on a mountaintop. You're the world's greatest engineer. A scientist. This is beneath you. Musk didn't respond. Larsen took a step forward. Tell them the truth. Tell them this is marketing. Tell them this is a joke. Still, Musk said nothing. Larsen's voice rose. Elon. Nothing. Then, slowly, Musk tilted his head. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud. But it cut through the room like a blade. What if I can't? A ripple ran through the audience. People froze. Because they had never seen Musk hesitate before. He was always the man with the answers. The man with the next big idea. But now he looked like a man who had seen something he couldn't explain. A woman near the back whispered, "Oh my God." A tech mogul, gripping his chair's armrests, muttered, "What is happening?" A hedge fund manager, beads of sweat forming on his brow, turned to his assistant. "Pull our Tesla shares. Now." A physicist in the crowd, one of the world's most renowned, sat completely still, his fingers pressing into his temple. Because he had spent the last 20 years studying quantum mechanics. And Musk's words? They weren't nonsense. They weren't even new. He had seen patterns in the equations. Patterns he had ignored. Patterns that shouldn't be there. And now Musk was saying them out loud. The first person to crack was a politician. A senator. A man who had spent decades believing he was in control. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping back, his hands shaking. "This is madness," he spat. "Absolute madness." Then he turned and stormed out. And that was the moment everything truly fell apart. People started moving now. Some pulling out their phones, texting, calling. Some sitting frozen, staring ahead like statues. Some, like the senator, leaving. A woman in the third row pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. A billionaire gripped his watch, checking his pulse. A young AI developer whispered under his breath, "No. No. No." And in the center of it all, Musk just watched. Then, suddenly, a deep voice cut through the noise. "Then tell us, Elon." Silence. All eyes turned. It was Roth. The trillionaire. The one who hadn't whispered. He stood now, his expression cold. Calculating. "If we're in a simulation," Roth said, his voice steady, "who's running it?" For the first time that evening, for just a moment, Musk hesitated. And the audience saw it. And the silence that followed was the loudest yet. A man in the audience stood up. A billionaire investor, visibly agitated. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "You're losing your mind, Musk." Musk tilted his head. "Then why are you still listening?" The investor clenched his jaw, looking around. The tension was suffocating. Someone else muttered, "What if he's right?" A socialite near the back whispered, "Then nothing we do matters." And that's when the real panic began. The room was still. No more murmurs. No more whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. Musk stood motionless, his hands resting on the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had dropped the bomb, and now he was watching the pieces scatter. In the audience, some sat frozen, unable to process what they had just heard. Others leaned forward, as if getting physically closer to Musk might help them understand. And then, finally, someone spoke. A billionaire banker near the front row, his voice hoarse. "Prove it." It was the challenge everyone had been waiting for. The rationalists. The skeptics. The powerful men and women who had built their empires on certainty. They needed Musk to be wrong. Musk's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked prepared. As if he had expected this moment. Behind him, the massive screen flickered to life. Numbers. Equations. Patterns. And then, one phrase appeared in bright white letters. "Physics is coded." The audience shifted as the screen displayed lines of mathematical equations. Most didn't recognize the symbols. But those who did, the physicists, the engineers, the AI developers, went pale. A professor from MIT leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. "No, that can't be." A young physicist shook his head violently. "No. No, this is coincidence." But his hands were shaking. Because deep down, he knew there was no such thing as coincidence in math. The camera feed cut to a renowned theoretical physicist in the audience. Dr. Henry Caldwell. Nobel Prize winner. The man who had once laughed at simulation theory. Now, he wasn't laughing. His eyes were fixed on the numbers. Because he had seen similar patterns in his own research. Because he had dismissed them as random. Because Musk had just put them on a giant screen. And because, in this moment, he realized he had been lying to himself. A hedge fund manager pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he typed. A tech billionaire wiped sweat from his brow, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. A politician clenched his jaw, gripping the arms of his chair like an anchor. People weren't just listening anymore. They were panicking. Because for the first time in their lives, they weren't in control. A man in the second row stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass of water. "This is bullshit," he barked. "You're playing with our minds." Musk turned his gaze to him. Calm. Calculated. "Then leave," he said simply. The man's face twisted in frustration. He wanted to. But he didn't. Because somewhere deep inside, he wanted Musk to be wrong. But he feared he was right. The room exploded into conversation. "This is insanity. This is the biggest hoax I've ever seen. Wait, what if he's telling the truth?" A woman in a designer dress gripped her chair, her knuckles white. A young AI developer whispered, "I always knew something felt off." And then, above all the noise, a sharp voice rang out. "Then who made the simulation?" Silence. Again. Musk exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the podium. "That's the real question, isn't it?" His words cut through the air like a blade. The question they hadn't wanted to ask. The question they couldn't ignore anymore. If this was a simulation, who built it? And more importantly, why? A man in his 60s, one of the top 5 wealthiest individuals on Earth, stood suddenly. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I refuse." He turned on his heel and walked out. Just like that. No words. No debate. Just the sound of his footsteps echoing through the silent auditorium. One by one, others started to follow. Not because they didn't believe, but because they did. A world leader. A billionaire's son. A scientist who had spent his entire career proving the opposite. And Musk just watched them go. Not stopping them. Because he knew. He had planted the seed. And whether they wanted to or not, they would never unhear what he had said. A woman in a designer dress stood up abruptly. "This is dangerous," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't just drop something like this on us." Musk folded his hands. "Why not?" "Because," she faltered. She didn't have an answer. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it cut through the silence like a razor blade. A single, calm voice from the audience, measured, deliberate. "So, what are you saying? That we're in a video game?" The words hovered, waiting for Musk's response. And yet, he didn't answer. Not immediately. Because he wanted them to sit in that question. To feel it. To let it infect their thoughts. In that moment, something shifted in the room. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't marketing. This was real. And the most powerful people in the world were trapped in the uncertainty of it. The man who asked the question, Raymond Stark, founder of Orion AI, worth over $700 billion, didn't sit down. He was one of them. The untouchable elite. The kind of man who didn't ask questions, he gave the answers. And yet, here he was. Waiting. Watching. Needing Musk to explain what was happening. He had built AI. He had played God. And now, he needed to know, was someone doing the same thing to them? A different billionaire, one of Musk's largest investors, scoffed and shook his head. "This is absurd," he muttered. His hands were trembling. He stuffed them into his pockets. "This is just another conspiracy theory. A waste of our time." He spoke loudly. Too loudly. Like a man trying to convince himself of something he didn't fully believe. The true weight of the moment wasn't in the ones who whispered. It was in the ones who said nothing at all. A young tech genius, barely 25, known for revolutionizing quantum computing, sat with his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. A powerful politician, always so composed, was gripping his wrist as if checking his pulse. A hedge fund manager, responsible for trillions of dollars, was blinking too much, as if reality itself had become too bright. These were people who were never unsure of anything. And yet, here they were. Doubting. Finally, Musk spoke. His voice was calm. Steady. But there was something in his eyes. Not fear. Not arrogance. Something else. "I'm not saying this is a game," he said. "I'm saying that, statistically, we are more likely to be inside an artificial system than a naturally occurring universe." He let the words sink in. Then, he continued. "If a civilization ever reaches the point where it can create a simulation indistinguishable from reality." He paused. Then, deliberately, "Why would we assume we're the first?" The screen behind him flickered again. A new set of numbers. Simulations within simulations. Patterns in quantum physics that shouldn't exist. Code hidden in the fabric of reality itself. Some people gasped. Some people leaned in. Some people closed their eyes. Because the moment they saw the numbers, they knew. This wasn't theory anymore. This was evidence. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. Someone else ran a shaking hand through their hair. A woman in the fourth row whispered, "Oh my God." A security guard near the back of the room tightened his grip on his earpiece, waiting for orders that weren't coming. Because this wasn't a security threat. It was something worse. One of the scientists in the audience, Dr. Isaac Raines, a renowned physicist, stood up so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. "No," he said firmly. "No, this is nonsense." Musk turned his gaze toward him. "Which part?" Raines' mouth opened, then closed. Because deep down, he knew. The math was right. But accepting it? That was something else entirely. A woman in the first row, Eleanor Voss, a billionaire investor, spoke, her voice unsteady. "If this is true," she hesitated. "Then what does it mean? For us. For everything. For the people who built their entire lives believing they were at the top of the food chain. If Musk was right, then they weren't at the top of anything." Musk looked at them. Really looked. Then he exhaled slowly. "If this is a simulation." A pause. A moment. Then it was built for a reason. A deep, suffocating silence crushed the room. Because that was the real question. Not if it was real, but why it was created. And what would happen if the one who built it decided to shut it down? The crowd was breaking apart. Some furious. Some terrified. Some just lost. A powerful politician in the front row finally spoke. "What are you saying, Elon?" His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. Musk exhaled. "I'm saying that if we're in a simulation," his voice lowered, "then whoever designed it is still watching." The room erupted. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence of sound, but the kind of silence that happens when something inside you breaks. For years, these were the people who dictated the course of human civilization. They made decisions that shaped industries. They controlled governments. They never doubted their reality. Until now. Musk's words weren't just changing their thoughts. They were changing their existence. And that was a horror they had never encountered before. A man in the third row gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A woman in the back reached for her phone, only to realize she had no one to call. Who could she even talk to about this? A young heir to an empire stared at Musk, his mouth slightly open, as if he was seeing him for the first time. The world had always been one way. But what if it wasn't? Someone snapped. A man in his late 50s, powerful, rich, a global real estate tycoon, suddenly stood up, his breath ragged. "No. No, I won't do this," he hissed, his voice shaking. People turned to look at him. He was trembling. "This is manipulation. This is just another trick." No one responded. Not even Musk. Because they all knew the truth. It wasn't a trick. And that's what scared them the most. A young physicist, his mind racing, tried to think his way out. He pulled out his tablet, opened a document, and started running numbers. He needed a counter-argument. Something to break the spell Musk had cast. But the deeper he went into the math, the worse it got. Because every answer led him back to the same conclusion. The probability of living in a base reality was close to zero. His fingers trembled as he closed his tablet. He couldn't disprove it. And that terrified him. A woman in the second row turned to her husband. "Say something," she whispered. "Say this is crazy." He just stared at her. "I don't know if it is," he whispered back. Her stomach twisted. This was a man who never hesitated. She had never seen him look like this. A tech billionaire, one of Musk's competitors, was shaking his head slowly. His brain refused to process this. He had spent his entire life believing that he was at the top of the food chain. That logic, that science, that technology were supreme. And now? Now Musk was saying that none of it mattered. That they were all part of someone else's program. That their wealth, their influence, their power meant nothing. His legs itched to stand, to leave. But his feet wouldn't move. Because deep down, he knew he couldn't unhear this. Security guards near the exits exchanged glances. They had been briefed. They had been told this was just another presentation. So why did it feel like something much bigger? One of them touched his earpiece. No new orders. No instructions. Just a long, empty silence from the other end. Like someone else was listening. A well-known religious leader in the audience sat completely still. If Musk was right, if this was all a simulation, then who was running it? Was it God? Or was God just another programmer? His faith had never wavered before. But tonight, it was cracking. And then, finally, someone broke the silence. Not with a question. Not with an argument. But with a single, desperate statement. I don't want to believe this. The words hung in the air. And that was the true breaking point. Because if belief was now a choice, then doubt had already won. Musk watched them. Every face. Every reaction. He knew this would happen. He had seen it before. And yet, it still fascinated him. Because these were the world's most powerful minds. And right now, they looked like lost children. Their entire worldview had been shattered in a single night. And they had no idea what to do next. Some stormed out. Others grabbed their phones, already messaging, already panicking. A young billionaire heir sat frozen in his chair, staring at nothing. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his wealth meant anything. A security guard at the back of the room put his hand to his earpiece. Someone was calling in, urgent. A billionaire investor stood, his face pale but his voice hard. This is where I draw the line, he said, his hands trembling. You can throw numbers at us all night, Elon, but you can't prove this. His voice carried through the room like a gunshot. Some nodded. Others stayed silent. Because they weren't sure anymore. Musk's gaze locked onto him. Then tell me, he said, his voice calm, too calm. Have you ever had a moment where you felt like reality itself glitched? The man flinched. Because he had. A woman near the front swallowed. I've seen patterns, she murmured. Things that shouldn't repeat, but do. A tech mogul nodded slowly. Sometimes I dream about things before they happen. A scientist clenched his jaw. I ran an experiment once. The results changed when I observed them. It didn't make sense. Musk's eyes flickered. Exactly. This isn't just math, Musk said. It's not just theory. He let the word settle. It's experience. Every person in this room, every billionaire, scientist, leader, had felt it. They had dismissed it. Ignored it. Pushed it aside. Because accepting it meant accepting that they were not in control. But now they couldn't ignore it anymore. The seed had been planted. And it would never leave them. Elon Musk stepped back from the podium, watching the chaos unfold. He had known this would happen. But he had to say it. Because if he was right, then everything they believed in was a lie. Some left. Not because they didn't believe, but because they did. A hedge fund CEO whispered to his assistant, "Sell our Tesla shares." A senator stormed out, muttering, "This is dangerous." A scientist sat frozen, staring at his hands as if they weren't his own. But others? Others sat. Quiet. Thinking. Processing. Because for them, something had changed. Musk looked at the ones who remained. He smiled. A small, knowing smile. And then, he said the last thing they expected. Just remember. A pause. If we are in a simulation. He stepped back from the podium. Someone is still watching. The lights flickered, and the screen behind him went black.